comes to mind when you think of a psychologist? What are they doing? And what do they look like? Are they in the same country as you? When I chose to become a psychologist, I imagined myself in a cozy suburban office having profound and meaningful conversations about life. I never imagined myself, an American, on this stage here in Northern Cameroon. Today, I'm going to share my vision for radical transformation in the field of psychology and the two major insights that led me to question everything I had been taught about my role as a psychologist in the world. In my university education, I learned that psychology is a study of the human mind and behavior. Our mind is made up of thoughts, emotions, and physical biology, a complex system of neurons, hormones, and synapses. Psychologists work to understand the connection between our biology and our environment in order to predict behavior. As I advanced in my doctoral training, I found that psychology was one of the most versatile disciplines on the planet. In addition to treating mental illness, psychologists can be found coordinating teams, designing airplane control systems, and even invented the original foot pedal trash can. These days, psychologists can be found in schools, governments, with sports teams, and even working with astronauts. Influenced by my childhood, growing up overseas and attending international schools, I was curious about how psychology was in other parts of the world. So after years of grueling clinical training in the United States, do you know what I did? I moved to the Fiji Islands in the South Pacific. But boy, was I in for a surprise. An entirely different reality was waiting for me. Upon arrival, I learned that I was the only licensed psychologist in the entire country. Over the years, I witnessed family members, counselors, and educators working above and beyond their scope of competence with limited resources. And soon, I became one of them. I realized that a decade of training in the United States had not prepared me for working across borders. The highly specialized models of care that I was familiar with were simply impractical. As I got myself up to speed on global mental health, I learned some staggering statistics. Did you know depression is the leading cause of disability worldwide? The World Health Organization estimates that 13% of adults have a mental illness. That's 1 billion people. For young people, suicide is a leading cause of death in every country in the world. Can you believe we now live in a world where there are more deaths by suicide than war or homicide combined? Trauma is part of the human condition. 70% of us will experience a traumatic event in our lifetime. This could be witnessing death or serious injury, or intimate partner and sexual violence. Clearly, there was global demand for psychological intervention. In wealthier countries of the global north, the treatment gap is 50%. This means that half of the people that need care for a mental illness receive any. In touristic paradises like Fiji or Cameroon, the treatment gap is as high as 90%. So I started to ask, what is the problem? Why was it so difficult to access mental health services even in wealthier countries with advanced medical systems? And what could possibly be the solution? This is where I began my journey of unlearning. I started to question some of the basic assumptions in my field. And first, I learned that psychology is weird. By that, I mean Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic. 95% of psychological research was conducted in countries that fit the weird description. I realized that as a field, we knew very little about the emotions, cultures, and desires of the global majority. And this is a problem for psychology as a viable science, but also because by the year 2100, North America and Europe are expected to only make up 13% of the global population. The majority of population growth is going to happen right here in Africa. Here's the thing. Cross-cultural psychology tells us that our biology is the same, but it responds differently based on culture and environment. Our neurobiology is cultural, and practicing psychologists haven't seemed to do much about this. Our weird research comes from university student samples that are easy to access. Let me ask you, do you think an American college student could speak for your experience? Even when I fit that description, I never felt like I really fit in or had a sense of belonging. The truth is, college students as a group are weirder than most. They're not great indicators of the human condition. In the world of scientific data, we call them outliers. But my journey of unlearning did not stop there. The more I started exploring, there was an even deeper problem underpinning the weird one. I discovered that the mental health industry needs to be decolonized. Many of us go into the profession well-meaning positive agents of change, but we don't actually understand that we're perceived as part of the problem rather than the solution. Mental health came to much of the global South through European systems of colonization. Mental asylums came right along with schools, churches, and prisons. And the more I delved into this issue, I became confronted with my own historical trauma. In the 1800s, my ancestors were displaced from India as cheap labor to replace African slavery after it was abolished. The indentured labor system shipped over 1 million Indians to British, French, and Dutch colonies in East and South Africa, the islands of Reunion, Mauritius, Fiji, and the Caribbean, including Guyana, where my family is from. They were given false promises and then abused and exploited. In Fiji, suicide rates on the plantations were directly tied to colonial policies that affected living conditions. In the Caribbean, our indigenous languages were outlawed and rum was traded for labor. Colonization is something that we all have to deal with. It took a long time for us to really realize the impact of these oppressive systems. It wasn't until 2021, last year, that the American Psychological Association finally apologized to Black, Indigenous, and people of color for its historic role in and complacency in racism. Even though colonization was a clear violation of human rights and well-being, psychological science did not ask questions about how colonial processes affected the human psyche. Even though colonization has ended, we still carry the burden of healing cycles of intergenerational violence and trauma, cultural erasure, which cannot be found in any diagnostic manual. I had to confront my own internalized depression. For a long time, I did not allow myself to heal. What did I have to grieve? Shouldn't I be grateful for the sacrifices of my ancestors? As a first-generation American, the privileges that were afforded to me seemed to point to how I had benefited from colonial violence. I am a native English speaker, highly educated, and a global citizen with proximity to whiteness. I had to undo my own conditioning from the global north and realize that The reason why our people are resilient is not because of colonialism or mental health saviors, but in spite of them. All across the global South, evidence-based treatments are being exported as gold standards of treatment without any evidence of their success in local populations. So when questions come to closing the treatment gap with engaging well-meaning foreigners like myself, without any knowledge of the local context that we're living and working in, we can actually do harm. Here I was teaching the theories of white men without knowing how to affirm indigenous ways of knowing and doing. I needed more tools. I stand here before you today with a vision that is neither an answer nor the solution. My hope is that it can spark change. I believe that psychology belongs to humanity. But in order for that radical transformation to happen, it involves all of us. What if psychologists were defined and the work they do by the context they live in and the people they work with? What if psychologists were as diverse as the human population itself? What if psychologists were everywhere? We could be tackling big problems like poverty, climate change, responsible food production and consumption, and COVID-19. We could be helping local entrepreneurs launch their brands. We could be ordinary people delivering interventions. What would happen if we stopped looking at mental illness as something that was solely chemical? If we raised the level of care from the individual to the collective? What would happen if we adopted social justice and liberation as guiding values of our work? Since becoming a global psychologist, far from my image of a suburban private practice, this is my ultimate takeaway. It's not that we of the global South need to replicate the psychology industries of the global North, but we need to slow down and critically define psychology for ourselves. And we might just find that we are the medicine. We are the medicine not only for ourselves and our people, but we may be the medicine for psychology itself. And if psychologists will be everywhere, we of the global North need to engage in a rigorous process of unlearning, learning, and relearning. If we wish to collaborate internationally, we need to be mindful of how much space we take up. And we need to prioritize historically silenced voices. We may need to tolerate distress and discomfort in difficult dialogues. We should interact with respect, curiosity, empathy, and cultural humility. And all of us need to work to understand how we can relate to one another in a world that is both globalizing and indigenizing. I close with the words of artist Lilla Watson and her fellow Aboriginal activists. If you have come here to help me, you are wasting your time. But if you have come because your liberation is bound up with mine, then let us work together. Thank you. Merci.